My name is Mia, and I want to share a story with you today. It's a story that has lived in my heart for a long time. I ask you to listen to it completely, because it might touch your heart in ways you never expected. It's not just my story. It's a story about love, loss, and the question that once haunted me. What is my fault? It all began on a cloudy autumn morning. The sky was painted in shades of grey, and a soft drizzle fell gently on the rooftops. I stood by the window of my small bedroom, watching the raindrops race down the glass. The world outside seemed quiet and calm, but inside me, there was a storm. I had just turned 11 years old, but I felt much older. You see, my parents were always fighting. The house was filled with voices that clashed like thunder. Their words were sharp, and their anger filled every corner of our home. I often hid in my room, hugging my old stuffed rabbit, trying to block out the sound. That morning, I could hear them again. You never listen. My mother's voice cracked with frustration. Oh, and you do. You always blame me, my father shouted back. I pressed my hands over my ears, but their words still reached me. I'm tired of this, Mark. My mother's voice shook. I can't live like this anymore. I shut my eyes tightly, wishing I could disappear. I didn't understand everything they said, but I knew what was coming. They had been talking about it for months. Divorce. I sat in the corner of my bed, hugging my knees to my chest. My heart pounded as I listened. I was afraid. I didn't want them to leave each other. I didn't want to lose the family I had always known. After what felt like forever, the house grew silent again. I slowly crept out of my room and walked into the living room. My parents were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. My mother's eyes were red and puffy, and my father stared at the floor, his hands trembling slightly. I stood there quietly, my small hands clinging to the edge of my shirt. Mom, I whispered. Dad. They both turned to look at me. Their faces softened, but their eyes were heavy with sadness. My mother knelt down and took my hands in hers. Her hands were warm, but her grip was weak. Sweetheart, she said softly, we need to tell you something. I already knew what it was, but hearing it still made my heart ache. We're getting a divorce, my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, trying to understand. My eyes filled with tears, and my lips trembled. Why? I asked softly. What did I do wrong? My mother's face crumpled. She shook her head quickly, pulling me into her arms. Oh no, baby. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. But I didn't believe her. Not really. I sat on the floor, clutching my knees, my tears falling silently. My parents tried to explain that they still loved me, that it wasn't because of me, but I didn't hear them. All I could hear was the voice in my head, asking again and again, what is my fault? The days after they separated felt blurry and heavy. My father packed his bags and moved out. I watched from the window as he walked away. He turned back once and waved at me, forcing a small smile. I waved back, but my heart felt too heavy to smile. At first, he visited often. We would go to the park and play on the swings. He would push me higher and higher until I felt like I was flying. For a little while, I felt happy again. But then, the visits became less and less. The calls became shorter. Sometimes they didn't come at all. One night, I sat by the window, waiting. I had been waiting for hours, my eyes searching the dark street. I clutched my stuffed rabbit and stared at the road, hoping to see his car, but it never came. The next day, when I asked my mother why he hadn't come, she simply said, "He must have been busy, sweetheart." But I knew better. Weeks turned into months. My father's visits became rare, and soon they stopped altogether. I would still stare out the window sometimes, hoping he would come back, but he never did. At school, I kept to myself. I didn't talk much, and I didn't play with the other kids. I sat alone during lunch, watching the other children laugh and run. I used to be one of them. I used to laugh too, but now I just felt empty. One day during art class, my teacher, Miss Harper, came and sat beside me. "Hi, Mia," she said softly, her voice warm and gentle. I didn't look at her. I just stared at the piece of paper in front of me. I was supposed to be drawing a picture of my family, but I had only drawn a house with no people inside. Miss Harper tilted her head slightly, noticing my unfinished drawing. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked kindly. I shook my head, quickly, trying to hold back the lump in my throat, but she didn't leave. She stayed beside me quietly, and somehow, her gentle presence made me feel safe. After a few moments of silence, I whispered, "Is it my fault?" Miss Harper's eyes softened. She gently brushed a strand of hair from my face and looked at me with such kindness that I almost started crying. "No, Mia," she said softly, but firmly. "It's not your fault. It was never your fault." Her words sank into me, but they didn't erase the pain. Still, something about the way she said it made me feel a little lighter. Just a little. That night, I sat by the window. Again, I held my rabbit close and stared out at the dark street. I didn't expect my father to come this time. I knew he wouldn't, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't ask, "What is my fault?" Instead, I whispered softly to myself, "It's not my fault." And slowly, quietly, I started to believe it. In the weeks that followed, I started drawing. Again, I drew flowers, skies, and sometimes I even drew my family. My family didn't look the same anymore. It was smaller now, but I still drew it, because even if we weren't together, they were still my family. One afternoon, my mother found one of my drawings on the table. She stared at it quietly for a long time. Then, she turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you miss him?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Every day." She knelt down and wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "Me too." That night, I sat by the window again, but this time, I didn't wait for my father's car. Instead, I closed my eyes and made a wish. I wish, I whispered into the night, that one day I'll feel whole again. And you know what? Slowly, I did. It didn't happen all at once. Some days were still hard. Some days, I still missed my father so much it hurt. But little by little, I began to heal. I found happiness in small things. The warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of birds singing in the morning, and the way my mother's voice sounded when she read me bedtime stories. And I learned something important. When people leave, it's not always because we did something wrong. Sometimes they leave because they are broken too, and their brokenness is not our fault. If you're still listening, thank you for sharing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart even a little, please subscribe and leave a like. It means so much and helps me share more beautiful and meaningful stories with you. And remember, sometimes people leave, but that doesn't mean we're unworthy of love. It just means that their hearts needed something we couldn't give, and that is not our fault. As the seasons changed, so did I. Grief, once heavy and sharp, slowly softened into something gentle. It became a quiet ache, like a song you once loved, playing softly in the distance. A song that makes you smile with a bittersweet warmth. One summer afternoon, I found myself walking to Grandma's old house. It had been months since I last visited. The garden was overgrown now, the wildflowers spilling over the stone path, and the wooden gate leaning slightly from years of wear. But it was still beautiful. The same soft wind stirred the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and jasmine. I made my way to the backyard, where the wooden swing still hung from the large oak tree. Its ropes were slightly frayed, but it swayed gently as if it too had been waiting for me. I sat down, slowly pushing myself back and forth, my feet brushing against the cool grass. I pulled the silver locket from beneath my shirt and pressed it against my chest. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. I could almost hear Grandma's voice. "You're stronger than you think, Lily." Her words echoed softly in my heart, giving me comfort. After a while, I walked over to the small wooden shed where Grandma kept her gardening tools. The door creaked slightly as I opened it, and the familiar scent of earth and dried lavender greeted me. I ran my fingers along the handles of the tools, remembering how she used to hum softly while she worked. And then, in the corner of the shed, I saw it, a small dusty tin box. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized it immediately. It was the box Grandma used to keep in her kitchen drawer, the one where she stored her little treasures, as she called them. With trembling hands, I picked it up and opened the lid. Inside were tiny familiar things. A collection of seashells we had, gathered during a beach trip. A pair of mismatched earrings she once let me play dress up with, and a tiny crumpled note with her handwriting. My eyes filled with tears as I carefully unfolded the note. It simply read, "My dearest Lily, you are my sunshine. Whenever you feel lost, remember that my love is always with you. Just close your eyes, and you'll find me in the gentle wind, in the warmth of the sun, and in the melody of your heart. I love you forever, Grandma. I pressed the note against my chest and let the tears fall. They weren't heavy tears of sadness. They were soft, quiet tears, the kind that come from feeling deeply loved. At that moment, I knew Grandma wasn't gone. Not really. She was still with me in all the little things. She was in the warm sunlight on my face. She was in the familiar scent of lavender on a summer afternoon. She was in the song of the birds, in the rustle of the leaves, and in the gentle hum of the world around me. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside the locket, alongside the photograph. Now I carried not only her picture, but also her words, their love and wisdom, close to my heart. In the weeks that followed, I found myself embracing life differently. I smiled more often. I stopped rushing and started noticing the little things. The way the morning sun painted the sky with soft hues. The way rain made the earth smell fresh and new. The way strangers smiled when you held the door open for them. And one day, something truly special happened. It was a late autumn afternoon, and I was walking home from the park. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched softly beneath my feet. I was lost in thought, holding the locket between my fingers, when I heard the soft melody of a familiar song. I glanced toward a small cafe on the corner. Through the open window, I could hear the music playing. The same song from Grandma's music box. My breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I walked inside. The cafe was warm and filled with the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries. I stood near the counter, listening to the song. An elderly woman sat alone by the window, stirring her tea slowly. Her hands were gentle and weathered, her eyes soft with age. She smiled faintly at me, and for a moment, I felt the same warmth I used to feel with Grandma. Without hesitation, I walked over. "May I sit here?" I asked softly. She looked surprised, but nodded kindly. "Of course, dear." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea. Then she spoke. "This song. It was my husband's favorite," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tenderness that made my chest tighten. I smiled softly. It was my grandmother's song too. Her eyes filled with gentle warmth. She placed her hand over mine, the way Grandma used to. "You have her eyes," she whispered. My throat tightened and I smiled. For the next hour we shared stories. Hers about her husband and mine about Grandma. We laughed softly at the funny memories and wiped away quiet tears when the emotions became too heavy. And as I left the cafe, my heart felt lighter, fuller. I glanced at the locket once more and smiled, knowing that somehow, in that moment, Grandma had guided me to that place, to that gentle woman who carried her own beautiful memories. It reminded me that love has a way of connecting us, across time, across loss, and even across strangers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I walked home, my heart warm with the certainty that Grandma was still with me. She was in every gentle hand that offered kindness. She was in every song that made me smile. She was in the quiet moments of peace and in the unexpected moments of connection, and I knew that no matter where life took me, she would always be there, carried in the rhythm of my heartbeat, in the memories that shaped me, and in the love that would never, ever fade. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It encourages me to continue sharing these beautiful, emotional stories with you. And remember, love is eternal. It never truly leaves. It simply changes form, lingering softly in the memories we hold close, and in the hearts we touch along the way.